4 o'clock, we can start. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the NITheCS Colloquium. My name is Francesco Petruccione, and I have the pleasure to introduce to you Sandra MacFadyen, who is today's speaker. Sandra has a joint PhD from Stellenbosch and the Vrije University in Amsterdam. And I think about 5 years ago, she joined the mathematical science department in the, we call it biomaths hub, yeah, as a postdoc, and is still engaged there. But she spends most of her time in the Kruger National Park, yeah, because she also worked with the South African national parks on various projects. Yeah? And for NITheCS, she's particularly important because she's one of the PIs of one of our research programs on biodiversity. Yeah? So without further ado, Sandra, thank you very much for being with us today, and you're welcome to start your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This earlier. Is there something to mark? I think it may have to switch something there now. Wait, here they come.
Okay.
Interesting. Should I use this one until it's fixed? As long as it doesn't start screaming when it turns on. Okay. All right. I'm keeping it on, and then I'm going to... No, don't keep it on. Turn it off. All right, everyone can hear me now? All right, perfect. Thank you. I'm sorry for that. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Francesco, for that introduction. And of course, thank you to NITheCS for providing the platform where we can actually share these ideas and showcase some of our research to try and encourage some more interdisciplinary research. And thank you to all of you that are here and those online for taking the time to come to this presentation. And I hope it will lead to some collaborations in future. And now this doesn't work. Technology hates me today. Okay. All right. As Francesco said, I'm part of the Mathematical Biosciences group in the Department of Mathematics here in Stellenbosch. The bio stands for biodiversity. And at the start of my career, I set out to try and unravel the complex tapestry of nature and develop a more holistic understanding of ecosystems. When I talk about nature, I'm sure all of you in the audience here and online will have a different scene pop up in your head. It will be different for most of you, but in most cases, I don't think it will be made up of one thing, but rather a composite of key elements that mean something to you. But for me, I think it was always this intricate mosaic that I wanted to pull apart like a puzzle, but that I could actually put back together again to try and understand it. And the key building block for biodiversity, for nature, is biodiversity. And if we break it down into just some core definitions before we get rolling, biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth, and it includes all living things and the ways that they interact with each other, as well as their environment. There are different components of diversity or biodiversity. The one level is species diversity, which represents different types of species found in certain habitats or ecosystems. Then you've also got genetic diversity, which are the genetic differences among individuals within the same species. And then you've got ecosystem diversity, which contains a variety of different ecosystems within a larger region. So a lot of my research is more macroecology, so I generally work at that level. But if we take that description and we break it down into the parts, you'll see that there's a definite scale to biodiversity, beginning with genes, populations of the same species, communities of different species, and then different landscape types or ecosystems. But this is actually only one dimension of biodiversity, and that is compositional diversity. There are another three that we don't generally talk about that much. One is structural and the other is functional, and they go through the same level of scales in themselves: genetic structure, population structure, ecosystem or habitat structure, and landscape patterns. Within functions, you've got genetic processes, population dynamics, interspecific interactions, and then landscape processes. So to be able to understand a full ecosystem, one needs to be able to understand those three components and how they interact together. Forgot to press the timer, sorry. All right, so to illustrate this a little bit more intuitively, you can think of each level of diversity as operating at different scales, but interacting within and between each level as processes that in the end form different patterns and functions. And I guess the main question is, why should we care? Why is it important? It's just a holiday destination, Kruger National Park. I only get to go there once a year. But all species, plants and humans, depend on each other to survive. So the loss of biodiversity actually leads to the loss of services that nature does provide us. And these are essential to the functioning of our society and of the economy, as well as the ecosystem health. These are broken down into different components, which include resource provisioning, providing us with food and water, regulating systems like pollination, air quality, and climate regulations, and then, of course, the cultural benefits. So biodiversity loss directly threatens ecosystem health, the services they provide, and ultimately human well-being. But why should we worry about this? Doesn't it just look after itself? And we are in a biodiversity crisis. According to the World Wildlife Fund in 2020 Living Planet report, on average, there's been a 68% decline of global vertebrate species populations between 1970 and 2016. The IUCN's Red Data List lists over 37,000 species, under 134 that have actually been assessed as being threatened with extinction. There are a number of other statistics I'm not going to go into detail with, but just to know that this is a major concern globally. And because of this crisis, they actually formed an intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services called NITheCS. So you might have seen this in the news recently. They released the reports, and they are releasing various reports slowly over time. So there are a number of reports associated with this. All of them are looking at the assessment of global and regional biodiversity and ecosystem services, highlighting their crucial roles in sustaining life, but then also pulling out those factors that are threatening their existence. And as part of this initiative, I'm also part of the B3 project, which is the biodiversity building blocks for policy. This aims to transform biodiversity monitoring into integrating diverse data sources and using essentially data cubes based on different variables that work into a framework that provide real-time access to data so that we can monitor biodiversity trends, loss, and change. And conservation plays an important role in preserving biodiversity, obviously. They are safeguarding habitats from degradation and providing vital refuges for endangered species. They ensure the ecological balance and resilience of our planet for future generations. Large protected areas in particular are especially important as they ensure the survival of wide-ranging species. They maintain essential ecological processes and offer better resilience against the impacts of climate change and habitat fragmentation. However, to ensure the continued existence of these protected areas, they need to be soundly managed using a holistic approach. And the issue comes in there when you need to try and understand the ecosystem complexity. How do you manage something if you don't understand it completely? And I'm going to take you through some of the experiences I've had working in Kruger to show you how complicated it gets. So Kruger is about 20,000 kilometers squared, or 2 million hectares. It's about half the size of the Netherlands. There's some other scales to show you how big the park is actually. It's difficult to put into perspective unless you put it against something else. And it's 42% of the park is actually classified as a wilderness area. So those are areas where there aren't any roads, there aren't any human developments. They do have some sound influence, so technically that's a little bit of a bloops, but essentially it's without human presence. And then the roads and the camps, those make up the rest. It hosts almost 2,000 plant species, over 800 animal species, and an unknown number of invertebrates. And this is where I'd like to start weaving this tale of complexity with you. So if you remember the scales at which biodiversity patterns are formed and maintained, and we understand that each level interacts with these different components within and between each level, we can pull apart the different drivers of these emergent patterns and processes. And we'll see that the physical environment is one of them. One of the aspects why the physical environment is important can be explained by Schofields law of tolerance, a simple process by which all species have some sort of tolerance limit for an environmental factor, beyond which those individuals cannot survive, grow, or reproduce. So in a situation where they aren't restricted by any physical barriers, like fences or mountain ranges, there's also often an environmental component that limits their distribution or their survival success. And you'll see the majority of species or individuals within the species are within this optimum environment range. Then you have a few less species where it's not as optimal. And then you have none of them inside unsuitable environments. And often there's some sort of critical limiting factor that's actually a cutoff or threshold against which these animals or plants or any type of species no longer exists. So in this way, in understanding the environment, we can start to understand species. And in that sense, if you take it a step further, does that mean that the more variety you have in habitats, that should equate to more species, right? And that's the premise that I started with when I started teasing apart these different factors. And one thing to keep in mind is that scale matters in these scenarios. You can imagine that the habitat preferences or the suitability for elephants is going to be completely different to something like an elephant shrew. Similarly, across different time scales, an elephant that can live about 70 years or a shrew about 4 years will have an elephant weevil that only lasts about a year, or a elephant fly, which is a month. So you've got spatial and temporal timescales. So to begin with, we show that within this biodiversity domain, it is positioned within this spatially and temporally dynamic environment. And over paleontological timeframes, many of these processes come together and form different base layers, which is your more static environment, your topographies, your geologies, and your soils, and then as well as your climate. And then with your soil substrate in place and climate in place, you can chuck your flora and fauna on top of that, and they can begin to establish and start interacting. At any point, disturbances can come in and influence those patterns as well as those interactions and the processes behind them. These disturbances can be natural in the form of floods or fires, but they can also be anthropogenic in terms of human developments, for example. However, at the end of the day, all of these influences should come together to generate a pattern. And these are deterministic variables that actually form these pattern and process feedback loops, where everything is related to everything else. So that sounds like a cop-out, but I'm going to show you why I say that in a minute. So here comes in the idea of our simple threads and chaotic weaves. So if I can get all of my little threads together, then surely I can figure out how I get this pattern. Well, this is what I thought when I started my PhD. And yeah, you'll see how wrong I was. You probably all already know that. It took me 3 years to figure it out, but I'm a slow learner. So if I begin at the bottom, I'll start building my threads together. Start at the bottom in the abiotic realm. I can begin by looking at the relationships between relatively stable variables like topography, geology, and soils, and the different patterns that you can actually see from satellite imagery. And if you put those all together and you start looking at these patterns over time and how they relate, I found that there's a level of complexity that was missing from the model, something that I ended up representing as total accumulated difference in landscape complexity. So if I had all these static environmental variables in my model and there was still something unexplained, I could map that and show this is the complexity that was not accounted for within my model. I thought, okay, I'm getting there. Obviously, there's something dynamic at play. I've already said there must be rainfall and climate. So I added in rainfall. And by including climate into the model, I thought I would first need to find data, of course, that was fine enough at its fine enough temporal and spatial resolution that I could start looking at these interactions. So I did that. And not surprisingly, in creating that rainfall data set in this case, I could already see that there were patterns that were temporally but also spatially dynamic, and they had large effects on other variables in the systems, things like available surface water and vegetation productivity, which, as you can already start to imagine, they should have profound effects on the distribution of species and other variables within the environment. So I looked at the dynamics of vegetation across Kruger, because surely plant phenology, vegetation structure and function are also important threads that I need when I start creating this weave. And not surprisingly, they are also spatially and temporally dynamic over time in space. So I've got the threads for my abiotic components together, the stationary variables, physical landscape variables, and other dynamic abiotic components like rainfall. And I also got threads for vegetation, so I think I'm doing pretty well. Then I start to add in the animals into the mix. So I needed to look at developing some predictive models for large herbivore distributions in Kruger. For example, trying to understand what drives the distribution and density patterns of elephants. And while clear patterns did emerge, the one constant was again change, with patterns changing over time, but also between groups of animals. So you can add in another layer of complexity here, whereas it's not just the species distribution in this case, but also within individuals. So you would have herd animals that actually behave quite differently to bull animals. So you can't just take one species and lump it together and start looking at the distribution patterns. And over time, there has also been shifts in these patterns. So once you think you have a trend, you think, all right, this is what's going to happen, but then something goes wrong or something happens that you just haven't figured out yet. And there are major changes even within that species itself. So this is just one species. I think you can already start seeing where I'm going when you start adding in more and more species. But yeah, I'm still pretty sure I'm getting there. It has to be a little bit like what I expect. But I need to add in disturbance into the system. Because I'm in Kruger, or I don't need to really include any human modification because it's a protected area. It's been protected for a very long time. So we're just going to do natural disturbances like floods and fires. And I'm being particularly interested in how the spatial temporal patterns of fire actually cause and affect vegetation structure and function within the park. And it's very interesting here when you start looking at the dynamics. Well, this is just the overall trend. But if you start looking at the dynamics, you can see how the management programs within the parks actually evolved as well. So if you look at the patterns that you see here, I needed to get back, there we go, from 1940s. It's very blocky. And that's because the management regime in those days was rotational block burns. So it was something you needed to put out in the beginning. Then they thought we need fire, so we better start burning in a rotational manner. But we need to keep it safe, so we'll have roads and we'll just chop it into pieces, and then we'll start burning in different times and try and simulate a natural environment. Then later on, they had a more laissez-faire effect where they would just let what happened happen. But that is creating in itself different types of patterns. But all right, I have all these threads now, so I should just be able to bring them all together to understand how pattern begets process and how process begets patterns. Keeping in mind that there are these feedback loops as well. So it's not just on one side, they're going backwards and forwards. But in the end, this was my biggest challenge, trying to bring together all of these variables in a way that I can understand how all these seemingly simple threads are interacting to generate these patterns. And I wanted to see and actually map the direction and magnitude of driver effects. So for example, rainfall should drive species distributions and vegetation dynamics. but it should also at the same time be driving fire. And the influence of fire should influence vegetation, which will influence animal distribution. But in return, those animals will actually influence the vegetation, which will also influence fire. So you can see it's this process of iterative interactions that is going on. So using structural equation models in this instance, which I won't go into details with the methodologies, but I was able to map the dominant drivers over time and say, okay, rainfall is really important in this southwest of the park, which makes sense because it is actually a high rainfall area. And fire is important in the basalts on the right, which also makes sense because they've actually got very high biomass. So there's often a lot of fires there. And then in between, you have elephants and buffalo that are interacting there. And lo and behold, what happens? Change. So even though I had those patterns themselves are actually changing in time as well. So it's the dominance of those drivers and the magnitude of that change. So the dominance of the drivers, but also the directionality is switching. And you're getting a completely dynamic system of drivers as well, showing that this is a complex adaptive system. And these interactions that are really interesting to me is something that I think interdisciplinary work really needs to try and unravel, because it's such an intricate weave of variables to try and understand those interactions. It's been really fun, but it's also been really frustrating. And I'm not done, because even though we're in Kruger and we're not supposed to have any in human influence, we still need to consider simple things like the progression of the park, the proclamation of it over time. And a prime example of this is how these small changes in initial conditions can lead to widely different outcomes. That fire example that I showed you earlier. Also the development of roads and the provision of waterholes. I don't think I have time, but there's quite an interesting story about how the provision of those waterholes actually made a big change in the system, unbeknownst to the managers at the time. And to give you an illustration of this, this is a exclosure in the north of the park. It's about 250 hectares. It was erected in the 1960s, and then another 50 hectares was added in about the 1980s. And this is inside the exclosure. So this is a fence line. That's outside. So what's the difference? We put a fence, but it's an exclosure within the park, so it's not something outside the boundary. So the inside had roan antelope. This exclosure was set up to try and enhance the protection of the species and try and build up their numbers. The outside had all the other herbivores as well as predators. Inside didn't have elephants, so the fence they erected was elephant-proof. The outside did have elephants. But the inside also didn't have fire, because obviously it's a very small area. We can't burn it with the roan inside there. But the outside also didn't have fire because they needed to do a fire break to make sure that it doesn't get to the boundary and then actually burn the plot as well. But the small area there did have fire. So the patterns there are a little bit less pronounced, but you can see that there are more trees. So these little red thingies here, I think it was hopefully self-explanatory, but they're trees. And there you can see a bit more of them here, and here less. So this is a clear example of how a small change like this can have a big influence on the patterns that we see. And these management actions that one can take can actually have bigger implications than we think and have knock-on effects that on things we weren't even imagining. And of course, it's not a closed system either. So it is essentially a small island within an ocean of threats, with a large number of pathways that are traveling through many different land use types and bringing with them all sorts of things in terms of rivers, river quality changes, also seeds of invasive plants. So it is a major pathway for threats like invasion. Just to give you some examples of the contrasts, here you see some rural houses. There we have some subsistence farm, not subsistence, agriculture, monoculture, forestry, and then some subsistence farming just on the boundaries. So that's just on the boundary of the park. Okay, so I've got all my threads together. Admittedly, I missed some threads. And those threads might not be that simple to begin with. But for the most part, I'm still thinking that I understand the system pretty well, and I'm going to get a nice weave together now that I've understood each of the different components. But I don't. And why is that? And I think most of you already know it's a lot more complicated than just plugging all these things together and seeing how they interact and looking at those changes over time, how they interact, because it's so many components over so many time and spatial scales. So that weave is complex. It's not just going from each of my elements into my structural equation model to tell me what's happening. And even the nature of those interactions themselves are dynamic. So if you're pulling one thread, it's going to pull everything else, and you're not always sure by pulling what is actually going to happen. And I think I only hope to really understand the system more holistically is to incorporate knowledge from different disciplines, like ecology and mathematics. So it's been really exciting being in the Mathematical Biosciences Hub, because we're a group of interdisciplinary people that we sit together and try and figure out different ways to look at ecological problems. And I think that's really the key to making new and innovative methodologies. So to explore these different ways that we could potentially collaborate, I'd like to break down some of the examples that I've shown you into its key elements. And I mostly work with raster data. And for those of you who don't know, it's basically a grid. So it's like a matrix, and it can be broken down spatially into pixels, which are essentially grids of different sizes. And I have a range of those for different years, depending on the system that I'm actually studying. And I have for this different variables, like rainfall, temperature, plants, and animals that are all within the same domain. And these are essentially, as I said, just matrices that are made up of different variables. And they have different values for each of those grids or localities. But it's also over time. So it's essentially a data cube that's representing data along different measures of interest over time. So it's a high dimensional data cube where each of these dimensions represents a time step in my database, and the cells in the data cube represent the measure of interest. But the tricky part comes in when you need to start looking at those interactions and the outcomes that those interactions actually produce. And I'm not there yet. So if anyone here has the answer, you're welcome to come and talk to me, or just tell everyone here so we can put us out of our misery. But I'd really like to take this opportunity to invite a collaboration. Ecological systems, I hope I've proven to you, if you didn't know already, are complex and adaptive. And it's really difficult to tease apart these different components and monitor their interactions. It's even more difficult in large protected areas because there are just so many more environmental variables at play, but there's also so much more pressure on keeping this protected area alive. There's not many of these large protected areas left that can maintain these complete ecosystems. And something that I think people often miss is that complex systems change is actually part of that healthy ecosystem. So especially in the management of the park in the early days, you had a command and conquer approach where you have to manage nature. You have the luxury in large protected areas that you can let it go and let it manage itself to some degree. But change is what is important in that ecosystem. In my opinion, it's that lack of change, both spatially and temporally, that we need to worry about. So the homogenization of the landscapes, or even the homogenization of impacts. People talk a lot about elephant impacts, and it's a big thing that people talk about. It's only impacting if the impact is homogenized. If you have a little bit of impact here and no impact here and no impact here, it's creating heterogeneity within the environment. So don't stress about it. Just make sure it's not homogenizing. And the best we can do, because it's difficult to do all these things, is actually just to monitor these dynamics of the change. If something is changed in the system, that's what you want to know, because that is leading to something happening in the system that shouldn't be, or is evolving in a way that you weren't aware of. If everything's going away the way it should, and the trends are in the direction that you expect, it's nature, let it be. But how do we do this? And how do we create these new and innovative ways to try and understand this? And that's where I'd like to invite everyone here and online. You guys want to chat and not end me. Just come and chat, and we can see how we can explore different ways to collaborate further on these and other problems. So thank you very much for your attention. And Francesco.
Oh, are there any questions for Sandra? Maybe let's start with the audience in this venue, and then we go online. Please. Sorry, I will run. There you go.
Hi, thank you. That was very interesting. You mentioned that we need to monitor how the systems change, and how homogenization is generally a bad thing. So do you think homogenization is a good predictor for things like bad things happening, such as loss of species diversity in natural parks? Are there specific changes that we associate with those kind of outcomes?
Thanks. Yeah, it's when I talk about homogenization, it's at different levels. So if we talk about habitat homogenization, and I take it back to the example I gave in the beginning, you can imagine if you've only got one type of habitat, the chances of you having multiple species in that habitat is much lower. So the more you homogenize, you're also taking away the variety of habitats, which can relate to variety of species in the end. But it's also the variety of the interactions themselves. And in terms of ecological processes, if you're missing some interaction there, it might be an early warning or an indicator that there's going to be a major change in the system. So monitoring those can also be a type of early warning system to try and have a look at what's going on. Because from my point of view, or the research that I've been doing, it was so complex that the best you can do is find a change, something that's happened out of the ordinary. And then you can start looking at what that is.
Thank you. I imagine because the systems are so complex, chaos is everywhere. So it's very difficult to find deterministic pathways towards a certain outcome and what were the root causes in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. And with some of the structural equation modeling I did, I actually saw that it was in both directions, but often there was a magnitude difference. So one would have a stronger effect on the other, for example. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the talk, for the presentation. I've just a quick question. Is there a way to distinguish between correlations and causalities? So, for example, you had this, you had the example with the fenced area, and in particular the outside, there was the region where there was fire, but there were more plants in that region. So I could imagine that there's just a correlation that because of the fire, there are fewer elephants around there. But that's just pure speculation. But so there are both correlations and causalities. So can you distinguish them, or is it difficult to do so?
So yeah, you've touched on the curse of ecology right there, the curse of a causality versus correlation. So it's extremely difficult to do, and a lot of the methods that we have in ecology cannot do that. With the structural equation modeling that I started to use, what was nice about it is that you could do it in both directions, and you could have a look and see what is an effect and what is a cause. So an example would be the example you gave with the elephants and the fire. So the fire would be opening up the vegetation as it burns, but at the same time that might then push elephants out of the area because there's no longer any large trees for them to utilize. And if you look at it in this way, you can actually see that elephants actually change the habitat in a way that fire is more pronounced than fire drives elephants. So you can look at it in both directions and then decide on which is the stronger one to try and tease apart this whole correlation and causation effect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. A non-mathematical question. I wonder if you could say something about the possible impact of poaching or vis-a-vis anti-poaching policies in the data that you look. I mean, you said it's a protected area, but I would assume there's still people going in there and taking things, right? Whether this has an effect, if you'll have look at that.
Yes, so poaching is another one of the big drivers of biodiversity loss, and Kruger is not immune to it. We've got a lot of rhino poaching, and elephant poaching is also increasing. We've looked at that. I wouldn't like to speak to it yet, but we have got one of our PhD students that is working on rhino poaching specifically to see if the distribution patterns of rhino have actually changed in relation to poacher activities. Just anecdotally, I haven't done any research on this, but anecdotally, I also have a camera track project in Kruger that's been going for a number of years. And it seems to me like rhino that I used to see a lot in the day, I generally only see them at night now. So don't quote me on that. It's anecdotal, but it looks like from the imagery, something's changing already.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sandra. Really great talk. I'm really impressed by your spatial data and the resolution of how many variables you're putting in. But as a geologist, I look at the temporal components. And I mean, you only have within human recorded history, mostly only to the 90s. It would be interesting to see if those patterns are easier to see if you take your timescale and go much further back. And there is a lot of plants and fossil remains that can allow you to do that. Maybe then you'd get away from this noise that you're seeing and get to see those larger temporal changes.
It's very true. There's quite a lot of work that has been done on pollen that they've found, historical pollen, to see if we could map the distribution of plants. It's not my field, but I know there is a lot going on. And you are going to give me the answer about the geology with the project that you're going to be working with in Kruger. So yeah, you opened up my eyes with regards to the time frames where geology is actually also having spatial temporal variations that I obviously didn't account for at all. So it will be interesting to see.
If you would indulge another question. Speaking about the historical record, I imagine the uncertainties in your data are much larger for your older records than your newer records. So how does your resolution in your data change over time? And also, how does the different levels of error and uncertainty between the different layers that you're adding interact with each other in this tapestry that you're weaving?
Firstly, it depends on the data that we're using. So, for example, that the fire history that you saw there, some of those blocky components are because 1940s, we didn't have any satellite imagery to start mapping these. So rangers would sit in their offices with a 1 in 50,000 map and sort of plot where the fire was. So if a block was burnt, they colored it in. Whereas now we can use satellite imagery and obviously get a mosaic burn patch to see exactly the intensity of the burn was different within that block. The whole block didn't burn. So in terms of that, yeah, it's very true. The opposite can be true for vegetation monitoring. There was a lot of work done on monitoring vegetation, and the research done in the old days. I mean, you had a PhD student that took 20 years to count 15 gajillion plant species and soil samples and backbreaking work. And now I think we rely a bit too heavily on remote sensing, and we forget that we actually do need to have some ground truth data to prove that those results that we're getting are locally relevant. But yeah, to answer your question about the level of uncertainty within that, it's difficult to take into account, and it depends on what you're using. Something like a census with animal data, what we often use is observers, and we put that in as a random effect. Also the type of, if the actual sample count methodology changed, we put that in as a random effect as well. So we try and account for it the best way we can.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.